Hello everyone, welcome to Module 7. In this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about the personal values and counseling reflection paper and then go into the behavioral theories and how they're applied to counseling. So, as for the personal values and counseling reflection paper, that is due Friday, October 28th at 11:59 p.m. if we're going to get specific. So this week, there's nothing due because of labs. Obviously, it's still important to be going over the material and reading, but no assignments, no discussion board, no quizzes are due. So that'll be the next week is going to be the personal values and counseling papers due. So I'm going to share my screen really quick and go over a few details. All right, so here is the information on the personal values and counseling reflection paper. Really quick how I got there. It's just under assignments. There's the personal values paper. Here's a lot of the information. If you click on this, it's going to basically be the same information here uh, with the key details. Just once again, to remind you really quick, no more than 5 pages in length. And to read through these instructions, the key is to really be thoughtful about these 5 areas. And these questions that are prompting you are to kind of help you to go into more detail, to go in depth of reflection, of thoughtfulness, of exploring your values and your initial kind of perceptions and perspectives in these 5 different areas. But I also want to show you the rubric. So this is how I'm kind of delineating between what is in this 100 to 90% range, what's in the 89% to 80% range, etc. So a lot of it is about the clarity and about the depth of reflection, the thoughtfulness, and then it kind of gets into grammar, APA style, that there's minimal errors with grammar here. There's a few more, some pretty significant, etc. So you can read through these and start to get that, there's just a few differences on how you're exploring, the level of your exploration, the level of, kind of really connecting thoughtfully to those question areas. If you have questions about this, please don't hesitate to reach out. I'd love to meet one-on-one in office hours to discuss this. All right, with that, I have another video. So another me will come up to talk about the behavioral approaches. All right, everybody. So now I'm going to talk about the behavioral approach and theories as they apply to counseling. So I think a big difference between the behavioral approach and just some of the humanistic and previous approaches is that the behavioral approach, I think, goes to a larger degree of a deductive process. So there's a framework that's really applied, like classical conditioning or operant conditioning, so that's structured already there, and then it's just applying it to clients. So I think that somewhat applies to like the humanistic person-centered, because there's this idea of congruence, unconditional public regard, empathy, the existential givens for existentialism, but they're a little bit more open-ended and just kind of seeing what will emerge for the client, creating an environment that will allow I guess the needs of the client to come to the surface. So I think that can be an important first, I guess, differentiator, is that the behavioral approach is much more, okay, let's apply these learning principles to the client and see how that changes. So this deductive process. Additionally, in the Corey text, talks about how this approach is really emphasizing what's directly observable behavior. So it's not as much focusing on insight or thoughts or feelings. It's just like, what are you doing? How are your actions leading to change or not? How are your actions leading to the continuation of your symptoms or not? So that I think that focus is important to recognize. So as I've just already mentioned, like these learning theories, particularly of classical conditioning, operant conditioning, these different, and the video demonstration is going to go into that a little bit more. So I'll defer to that, because I think they talk about that well, of kind of giving a brief overview of those principles if you need a refresher, and then kind of how they apply to counseling. So another important, I guess, distinguishing factor for the behavioral approach is that it's really just focusing on like how can we resolve the problematic behaviors. So once again, insight is less important in this process. On page 270 or 237 in the Corey text, it also kind of talks about how insight might occur as behaviors are changed, but insight isn't really required to change behaviors. Like the behaviors can change and resolve some of the symptoms, and if whether or not the client like has insight about that is less relevant. Because once again, the importance is how can that behavior or how can those problematic behaviors be limited. As long as that occurs, then that's the key goal of counseling. So I think there's another quote that's actually originally by Paul in 1967, where it says, the kind of the goal of behavioral theories is that we're trying to find what treatment by whom is the most effective for this client with that specific problem and under which set of circumstances. So it just gets really specific. How can we just narrow into like this particular circumstance, client, treatment, when it's applied, how it's applied, under which circumstances, to really eliminate the problematic behaviors. Once again, the action orientation approach is saying how can actions lead to resolution of symptoms and concerns. I think another important part of this approach is that it talks about this ABC model, and the next module we're also going to be talking about that. But the ABC model for behavioral has to do with, what are the antecedents? What are those things that happen before the behavior of concern? And so A would be the antecedents. B would be the behavior. What behavior emerges? What that's concerning or that we'd like to increase, that's working well and we need to increase. And then the C is what's that consequence? What's the consequence of that behavior? So this idea is that you can manipulate what happens before. Maybe there's certain circumstances in the client's life, like maybe before an argument, the client is tired. That's like if they haven't gotten enough sleep, then they're more prone to move to conflict-oriented. Got close to the window. Like conflict-oriented behavior. So if you adjust the sleep pattern, then maybe that'll mean that there'll be less fighting behaviors or like kind of arguing behaviors. Or you could even, manipulate the consequences. So if you're working with the family system, you could kind of change how the parents respond to the child. Maybe this child's crying a lot and then they give them, a treat, so it's almost like, oh, you're reinforcing the crying because you're giving them a treat. They like that, so it might lead to more of that behavior. So being able to kind of consider how can we adjust the consequences to lead to the behavior that we want. So then I guess the roles are another important thing. As you can hear from all these different things that I've been talking about with the behavioral approaches, that the counselor is much more of an expert, almost like an expert in the learning process. Maybe like a consultant to consult with, hear ideas of how you can adjust behaviors or the antecedents or the consequences that you give. They might be a problem solver, or even a teacher. The counselor might be a teacher. So that applies to some of the skills of like progressive muscle relaxation that's talked about in the text, systematic desensitization, exposure approaches or exposure therapies, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, otherwise known as EMDR. So the counselor can be a little bit more psychoeducational and instructing with when specific behaviors are being targeted, and they can often do that through some of these means that I've just been talking about. So if you're interested in this, if this is resonating with you, or if you're just like, hey, I want to make sense of this a little bit more, I'm not sure where I sit with it yet, but there's a behavioral analyst that is a guest lecturer that's posted in the videos as well for this module. So I definitely encourage you to watch that in full, as she has, a lot of experience in this area, as she was trained specifically as a behavioral analyst. Okay, I want to briefly touch on the third wave, or the mindfulness-based behavioral approaches, before I wrap up. So yeah, these are called like the third wave. It's almost like it's an embrace of the emotional and cognitive connections with behavior. It brings in, the mindfulness and acceptance elements to behavior. Let me grab my book really quick, because I think there's some good quotes in the Corey text on page 251. So the Kabat-Zinn was being quoted here in the Corey text, and stating that mindfulness is the awareness that emerges through having attention on purpose in the present moment and non-judgmentally to the unfolding of experience moment by moment. So obviously it's like, how can we just attend and focus on the present moment without needing to change it, without needing to fight it, without needing to run from it, just being able to sit with the present moment, being able to kind of embrace it and accept it. And then I guess that leads to acceptance. So Corey talks about how acceptance is a process involving receiving one's present experience without judgment or preference, but with curiosity and kindness and striving for full awareness of the present moment. So acceptance can be really difficult. A lot of times what's creating the symptoms for some clients is that they're fighting it. They're so uncomfortable with their present moment that they're trying to like change it and argue against it, fight it. But sometimes this almost radical acceptance of saying it can be there. I don't have to fight what's present in my life. I don't have to run from it. I don't have to avoid it. I could just, there it is. Because this idea with mindfulness and acceptance is that our thoughts aren't us. Our thoughts are just thoughts. Our feelings are just feelings. They don't own us. They don't define us. They're a part of us, but they're almost like this mindfulness-based perspective gives them a distance to say, okay, there they are out, and I can notice them. I can sit with my thoughts and my feelings. And as they wash on by, they're gone. Maybe they'll come back again later, and there they are. I can just notice them, not fight them, just let them go. So that kind of leads to the ACT, the acceptance and commitment therapy approach. So in this approach, I really kind of want to emphasize this because I've done a little bit of trainings, further trainings in this approach. Because so the acceptance side of acceptance and commitment therapy is that mindfulness side of embracing whatever thoughts you're having, whatever feelings you're having, not needing to fight from them, not needing to run from them. And then the commitment is committing to a values-based way of living your values that are meaningful to you. So no matter what thoughts or emotions you're having, still committing to what's meaningful and purposeful to me. I'll have maybe these troublesome thoughts that have been troublesome in the past, but I'll work on just noticing them, not focusing on them so much that I'm kind of stuck in this cycle, just ruminating. But I can just, okay, there they are again, let them go by, and then I'll keep coming back to my roots, these values, and live in that space rather than in this spiral, focusing on and fixating on thoughts. So one brief, I guess, so some metaphors are sometimes used in ACT, in acceptance and commitment therapy. So I'll share one of these metaphors, and sometimes these are kind of taught to clients and then processed and what they might mean to them and how they might apply. But so just imagine that. So in this metaphor, imagine that there's an individual who just graduated with their master's degree. They're really excited. They're having friends and family over to their house, and they're really enjoying it. And they go home, the party's all set up, people start arriving, and then Joe comes. And Joe is someone where you're just like, oh no, I don't want Joe to be here. Joe doesn't have good manners. He like wipes his shoes on like the napkins and then puts them back on the table. He just like puts his hand all over the different food and is eating it and burping and just kind of doing kind of gross behaviors that are just kind of like, it's pretty uncomfortable to you. So this, I guess, either you, if you're the person who graduated, or just the person who graduated in this metaphor, goes up to Joe and just says, "Hey, Joe, like I want you to not be here at this party." So Joe goes out the front door, but then you see him climbing in the window. He's climbing through the window, and he's like, just creating issues again. He's dropping stuff. He's just spilling things over. And you say, "Joe, you got to go." You go out the back door. Then Joe just keeps coming in. He keeps finding ways through different windows, through different doors. Like you can't stop him from coming in. So this person who just graduated is so focused on Joe that they're just miserable at the party the entire time. And I guess then a part of this metaphor is then maybe someone just says, you know what? Or the person finally just decides, you know what? Joe's going to be here. I can't stop it. Joe's here. He's going to be doing what he does. And so instead of focusing on Joe and his concerning behaviors, the person starts to just focus on their family that's there and their friends. So they start to have a good time, even though Joe's just kind of there. And then sometimes Joe just leaves on his own, but then he comes back, but the person isn't fixated on Joe anymore. So that's one metaphor. It might kind of sound, so you might just kind of sit with that and see what the client does with it. Or, enact, you might also be a little more directive, it kind of depending on their approach. But the idea is that Joe, if you fixate on Joe, then you're going to be more concerned. Joe can't be stopped. He keeps finding a way no matter what. So you could spend all of your energy focusing on Joe, and then you're just drained and frustrated because you can't control Joe. So that's kind of related back to your thoughts. Sometimes clients try to control their thoughts, try to fight their thoughts, try to force their thoughts out, try to force these feelings and these reactions out. But they just are, and they'll just keep coming back. So instead of focusing on them, focusing back on what you value. So in this metaphor, the family and friends at this graduation party. So, anyways, that's just one practical, element of how that might be applied, or how a metaphor might be used to kind of psychoeducate a little bit, and then also kind of create some conversation with the client to address these principles and see how they might apply to them. So those are a few ideas on the behavioral theories and how they apply to counseling. So yeah, if you have any questions, let me know. Thanks.